Hello, this is Melissa, and I am with Jared again today, and we are going to cover the Treaty of Versailles, and that's 1919 to 1929, is the time frame that Carol Quigley gave it, and that is Chapter 6. Hello, Jared.
Howdy, Melissa.
How are you doing?
Well, I'm a bit worn out and ready to nip this in the bud and go over this extensive chapter, which covers, I think, more than anyone could really comprehend. But I wanted to say it's broken down into 4 sections. It's the peace settlement, 1919 to 1923. Security, 1919 to 1935, disarmament, 1919 to 1939, and I think the most important, well, probably besides the peace settlements, but then also the reparations, I think, was also one of the most important things, which was 1919 to 1932.
I think so. That struck me too. And I was just mentioning to you before I hit the record button that this morning I had gone online to see if I could actually find the whole Treaty of Versailles, because he certainly, I've heard about it my whole life and he writes about it, but I wanted to look at it. And I noticed, I didn't have time to read the whole thing, but I noticed how much weight in the treaty is put on the League of Nations and how much weight is put on reparation. A lot, But it was fascinated me to see that much about the formation of the League of Nations in the document. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I feel like France really was pushing for that because they didn't feel like they had security, and they kept pushing for it, and they weren't happy until they got their security, and it seemed like Britain was already happy because they had gotten their economic endeavors in line, and that seemed like that was their main concern, because what Quigley was saying is that most of the West and the not backwards countries were already secure, so they weren't worried about security. They were worried about their economic endeavors.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point there right off the bat, too, because Quigley mentioned this several times about how important security was to France. And then also what Quigley conceded was what he said that the powers did not recognize, which is there cannot be disarmament without security coming first. Nobody was willing to talk about disarmament. It took a long time to hammer anything out. And then the actual implementation of the disarmament that they had all agreed to do, a lot of it didn't happen simply because people did not feel secure.
Yeah, and France had its hands full with Germany. Yes, I heard you the whole time.
Okay, sorry. I'm not sure what happened, but my mic got disconnected and the virtual mixing board stopped recording, but I don't think I lost very much, so I'm back. So, yes, the actual practice of disarmament wasn't implemented in any way as to what was agreed, how they agreed that they would disarm. It was grudging with the Central Powers. It was almost built in to the agreements to give room for Germany to do what it did, which was rearm and move into key places. So that was interesting to me.
Britain went back to its old power play, which was to keep its second in power, to counteract or counterbalance the second power in Europe. They would allow Germany and others to grow, just to keep their balance of power. And Quigley says right off the bat in the second paragraph that even the victors and the defeated were subject to detailed criticism for 2 decades.
Where was that passage?
It's the first page, or the first on the peace settlement, the 267.
Yeah. Yes, I see that. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting thing, too. He elaborates on that, but he said the causes of the discontent with the settlements of 1919 to 1923 rested on the procedures used to make the settlements rather than the terms of the settlements themselves. And it appeared that there was a lack of trust, that a lot of the key things were done in secret by the great powers, and only the great powers had access to what went on in those meetings. And when he outlines how many times the different powers and councils and organizations met, I also found that to be very interesting as well.
Yeah, he kept mentioning that there was a public view, and then there's the things that went on behind the scenes, and he talks about the high-minded principles which were supposed to be applied and those that were really applied, and then he goes on to go in straight back into the propaganda, which was still very prevalent in the power politics and secret diplomacy, and it really makes you scratch your head who these he says, like, the secret powers were, or the real powers. He never really says who it is.
We get some clues. You're right. He doesn't say who it is. We get a few clues. One that jumped out at me was on page 271 when he's talking about where the peace conference was held and the Supreme Council held different meetings, and he outlines all those. And he said at all of those meetings, as at the peace conference itself, the political leaders were assisted by groups of experts and interested persons, sometimes self-appointed.
Yep.
Many of these, quote, experts were members or associates of the International Banking Fraternity. At the Paris Peace Conference, the experts numbered thousands and were organized into official staffs by most countries even before the war ended. These experts were of the greatest importance. They were formed into committees at Paris and given problem after problem, especially boundary problems. I'm less interested in the boundary problem, although it does make me... What I wanted to learn more about and was the Polish corridor, because this is very interesting. He said that the one case where a unanimous report was not accepted was concerned with the Polish corridor, the same issue which had forced the Supreme Council to be cut down to the Council of Four in 1919, and the issue which led to the Second World War 20 years later. So that was an interesting thing that I'd like to learn a little bit more about. But back to the experts, I think that what we don't know, because we're never going to be given really what happened behind those closed doors, but I think if we put together from different sources, this group of experts that he calls the International Banking Fraternity had ever so much to do with what was actually formulated over there. We know that the Warburgs was there. I can't remember which, the Warburg, one of the Warburgs was there, and they might both have been there. I think it's possible that one was there as a representative representing the United States, and one was there representing Germany, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely weird how he kept talking about the experts, but then also he was like kind of criticizing them, and also saying that I have have a paragraph here on 268 at the bottom of the page, and he says, "It is clear that the peace settlements were made by an organization which was chaotic and a procedure which was fraudulent. None of this was deliberate. It rose rather from weakness and ignorance, from failure to decide before the peace was made who would make it, how it was to be made, and on what principles it would be based. The normal way to make peace after a war in which the victors from a coalition would be for the victors to hold a conference, agree on the terms that they hope to get from the defeated, then have a congress with the latter to impose these terms, either with or without discussion and in compromise. It was tacitly assumed in October and November 1918 that this method was to be used to end the existing war. But this Congress method could not be used in 1919 for several reasons. The members of the victorious coalition were so numerous, 32 allied associated powers that could have agreed on terms only slowly and after considerable preliminary organizations. This preliminary organization never occurred, largely because the President Wilson was too busy to participate in the process, was unwilling to delegate any real authority to others, and with a relatively few intensely held ideas, like the League of Nations, democracy, and self-determination, had no taste for the details of organization. Wilson was convinced that he could only get a League of Nations accepted. Any undesirable details in terms of the treaties could be remedied later through the League. Lloyd George and Clemenceau made use of these conviction to obtain numerous provisions in terms which were undesirable to Wilson but highly desirable to them.
This is interesting too, the role that Wilson played in all of this, and also his kind of right-hand man advisor, who was Mandel House, sometimes called Colonel Mandel House. And they represent, almost any characterization that you get of Wilson represents him as so idealistic. And his 14 points in his League of Nations, it's just idealism. And his sense of being defeated because he could not sell the League of Nations to the voters of the United States. And this was really more or less his baby. This is how it's characterized to us. And this idea that he wasn't willing to get into the complexities, I don't know. I had just read last year a biography of Bernard Baruch, who was a Wall Street investor and became friends with Wilson and spent several years in Paris at these negotiations. And there were just a couple of really interesting things that I was able to get in that biography. And the first was he didn't care for Mandel House. He comes across, and I don't know if this is just what he wanted his biographer to think about him and write about him, but he comes across as a real idealist. Now, this is a finance guy, right? An investor, a Wall Street speculator. But he comes across as everything he did was done on ideals. The other thing, too, towards the end of the war, I don't remember now what the organization was called that Wilson put him in charge of, but basically Baruch became the guy who headed some kind of what you would call a war supplies commission on how resources are going to be used and which branches of the military and which parts of the world are going to get the resources. In other words, it was an incredibly important job that Wilson tasked him with before the end of the war. And then he's over here shaping this. Just one example of a finance guy, not really a banker, but a speculator who was one of the experts weighing in on what needed to be accomplished there. I found that really interesting. And I'm not sure what he had against Mandel House. I couldn't really figure that out from the biography. The sense that I got was that he just wanted history to remember him as the bestie of Wilson, his best advisor, his best friend, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's weird how he would just delegate something so important to somebody else for the organizations or the organization of all the resources, and so much importance on somebody else.
And really private sector, and that's a good insight too into the way our nations have always been run, I think, and certainly in the 20th century and to the present, is that we have this idea that elected officials are doing things for our benefit, which is really naive, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's always been public-private. You've got the facade of governing the people, but behind the scenes, and this really comes out in the Versailles Treaty and all of the different conferences leading up to it, is that there was so much personal and corporate interests at stake.
Yeah, and I feel like the public-private individuals will go back and forth. They'll go and switch seats between public and private. Either they're doing business with the people in public, or a public official will switch over to the private sector to continue their self-serving agenda.
Absolutely. And just the one thing that I got by looking at the treaty itself, it lists the main countries there, these powers that are the principal powers: the United States of America, the British Empire, France, Italy, and Japan. And then their principal allied powers, and there's a whole list of countries there. Mm-hmm. But then it goes on to tell you who is representing each country. Just an example of the key representatives for Great Britain included Milner and Balfour.
Yep.
And you look, I saw the same thing in South Africa, where you've got the soon-to-be Prime Minister, Smuts. It's, he's there with the sitting Prime Minister, and then, so you're seeing people that are either going to assume an elected highest leadership, or you look at people like Balfour and Milner, and I saw a few other names down the list, and I can't pull them up right at the moment, but that also you're like, they called in a favor from that time, and that was certainly fortuitous for their career.
It says when the treaty with Germany was signed, it was 5 foreign ministers: Balfour, Lansing, Pynchon, Titoni, and Maconi. Those are some of the people involved. But what I was really blown away is how many times they met.
Yes.
In a short amount of time. And even in one of the sections, he said how many sheets of paper there were, and it was in the millions, multiple millions of it. I'm like, how is this even possible? Like, how do you have that much time and money and just to top up a whole continent and make all these? And he says, I really wish I knew how many times he said secret in just this chapter, because I tried to annotate all those little sections where he would talk about it. Just in this one page on 270, I see secret at least twice. Mm-hmm. And they were given like this just dual perception of what was really going on. And I think he said by the end of it, everybody in the West had a bad feeling or something to that effect about the Versailles Treaty.
Yes, I think it was ashamed was the word that he used. They were ashamed. even common citizens, I think, became aware of some of the secret things and the unfairness of special interests in these secret meetings, and they were ashamed.
Yeah. And it didn't make sense that for Germany to be allowed into the negotiations. That was one thing that he also pointed out too, because they were basically making a deal with the so-called enemy. And he mentioned that. I'm trying to see where, here it is. It says, since the Germans had been promised the right to negotiate, it became clear that the terms could not be first made the subject of public compromise in a full preliminary conference. Unfortunately, by the time the victorious great powers realized all this and decided to make the terms by secret negotiations amongst themselves, invitations had already been sent out to all the victorious powers to come to an inter-allied conference to make preliminary terms. As a solution to this embarrassing situation, the peace was made on two levels. On one level, in the full glare of publicity, the inter-allied conference became the plenary peace conference, and with considerable fanfare did nothing. On another level, the great powers, there it is, worked out their peace terms in secret, and when they were ready, imposed them simultaneously on the conference and the Germans. This had not been intended. In fact, it was not clear to anyone just what was being done. As late as February 22nd, Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, still believed they were working on preliminary peace terms, and the Germans believed the same on April 15th. While the great powers were negotiating in secret, the full conference met several times under rigid rules to prevent actions. These sessions were governed by the iron hand of Clemenceau, who heard the motions he wanted, jammed through those he desired, and answered protests by outright threats to make peace without any consultation with the lesser powers, at all the dark reference to the millions of men the great powers had under arms. On February 14th, the conference was given the draft, the Covenant of the League of Nations, on April 11th, and the draft of International Labor Office. Both were accepted on April 28th. On May 6th came the text of the treaty. Only one day before it was given to the Germans, at the end of May, came the draft of the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria. But I just think it's interesting, too, how he's talking about the International Labor Office. It's just weird how all these international organizations are already taking form through this war.
I'll leap ahead over to page 291 because you just reminded me of these organizations taking form. This is about the League of Nations. I'm going to jump into how it was organized. It says the League of Nations consisted of three parts: the assembly of all members of the League, meeting generally in September of each year. 2, the Council, consisting of the great powers with permanent seats and a number of lesser powers holding elective seats for 3-year terms. And 3, the Secretariat, consisting of an international bureaucracy devoted to all kinds of international cooperation and having its headquarters in Geneva. The Assembly, the Assembly was the first, which is all the members, like, how the UN gets together and they've got a representative from every country. In spite of its large numbers and its infrequent meetings, proved to be a lively and valuable institution, full of hard-working and ingenious members, especially from the secondary powers like Spain, Greece, and Czechoslovakia. The Council was less effective, dominated by the great powers, and spent much of its time trying to prevent action without being too obvious about it. Originally, it consisted of 4 permanent and 4 non-permanent members, the former including Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Germany was added in 1926. Japan and Germany withdrew in 1933. The Soviet Union was admitted in 1934 and was expelled in 1939 after its attack on Finland. Since the number of non-permanent members was increased during this period, the Council ended up in 40 with 2 permanent and 11 non-permanent members. Now, I'll just read one more paragraph because I think this really plays into how ultimately how the United Nations was formed, and also the idea of permanent bureaucrats, permanent international bureaucrats. It said the Secretariat was slowly built up, and by 1938 consisted of more than 800 persons from 52 countries. Most of these were idealistically devoted to the principles of international cooperation and displayed considerable ability and amazing loyalty during the brief existence of the League. They were concerned with every type of international activity, including disarmament, child welfare, education, drug traffic, slavery, refugees, minorities, the codification of international law, the protection of wildlife and natural resources, cultural cooperation, and many others. And it just made me think that how successful we think of the League of Nations as being short-lived, and it talks about how the great powers, or the council consisting of the great and the lesser powers, may not have been as effective as they hoped. But I think what they developed during this time was a body that actually transferred over into the United Nations. This Secretariat, or as Alan would point out, Soviet, is ruled by council. And I think when you look at the way that the United Nations is organized and their history, they're into everything. They've got a body and an organization for everything. And all of what we look at when we think about Agenda 21, now Agenda 2030, and the Sustainable Development Goals, all of this springs from the United Nations. And you have exactly, for the last decade, the kinds of criticisms about how the United Nations doesn't have enough power, it's hamstrung, etc., that were leveled at the League of Nations. So it feels to me like the United Nations is either going to get a total makeover, or we're due for another supranational organization, another governing body. It's interesting, though, to me. The creation of lifelong bureaucrats.
Yeah. Whenever I think about these organizations that build on top of each other, I just think about things in terms of construction and how they basically cleared the ground and made it flat and built a foundation just so they could keep building on top of it. And I don't know if it helps anyone to think about things in those types of terms, but that's how I always think about it, that they're just building on top of each other and creating a giant superstructure. But some of the things that they were covering here were economic, financial organizations, organization for communications, transit, international health organization with offices in Paris, and the Intellectual Corporation Organization with branches in Paris, Geneva, and Rome. So these to me, yes, I don't know if I said international justice, but it just, to me, it sounds like this International Health Organization sounds like the precursor to the World Health Organization. I could be wrong, but it's just, those are like embryos, nuclei to these things that just keep growing. They keep building on top of it. And one of the things that really stuck out to me too was how Cecil Hurst wrote one of the articles, if you will. This is on page 290 on the left. Just how all the holes were concealed under a mass of impressive verbiage, and that they were trying to, I guess, plug the loopholes. And some of the loopholes were peaceful procedures for settling all disputes, outlawry for non-peaceful procedures for this purpose, effective military sanctions to compel the use of peaceful procedures and prevent the use of warlike procedures. And it's just crazy how the politicians and the bureaucrats and the international bankers, they all know how to read these pieces of legislature and write them just to suit themselves.
And that is interesting. That reminds me of something else that stayed with me, and that was on the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And this is on page 295. And Kellogg was an American and Briand a Frenchman. And it's described, this came out of 1928, it's described as a weak and rather hypocritical document and advanced further toward the destruction of international law as it had existed in 1900. We have seen that the First World War did much to destroy the legal distinctions between belligerents and neutrals, and between combatants and non-combatants. The Kellogg-Briand Pact took one of the first steps toward destroying the legal distinction between war and peace, since the powers, having renounced the use of war, began to wage wars without declaring them, as was done by Japan and China in 1937, by Italy and Spain in 1936 to 1939, and by everyone in Korea in 1950. Now, this book was written and published in 1966, but I thought that this was a very interesting thing that he was saying. I haven't read the Kellogg-Briand Pact, but him characterizing it as one of the first steps toward destroying the legal distinction between war and peace was so interesting, because post-1966, I mean, essentially, really, since Vietnam, do we go to war? Do we declare a war? We have, the Gulf War. We may call them a war, but these are conflicts, really, in which we don't. We're told that we have enemy combatants, but it's very, very different than what we saw in World War I. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around it. They'll declare war, but they'll say it's a war, but it's all legal. It's all on paper.
We have a couple of things in recent memory that they've actually put the word war on, but so many times what we have are things that are called operations.
Yeah, that's another thing. It's a definite military term.
Yeah. And these operations can cost a fortune, and they can go on for a long time, and a lot of people can die, but evidently it's not war.
What comes to mind is the war on terror, and I think that's never going to end, unfortunately, unless the people stop it.
What else?
Well, I wanted to get into the reparations section, because I think that's what destroyed all of the economy and what basically led into the Second World War, I guess. I have a paragraph, I guess, right before the reparations, which I thought was pretty important, but I'm not sure if I'm going to read it all, because it's a lot here, but I guess it ties into... I guess there is a pretty good couple points here that I thought needed to be said. He goes on to say, the total failure of disarmament efforts between 1919 and 1935 and the Anglo-American feeling that these efforts handicapped them later in their conflicts with Hitler and Japan have combined to make most people impatient with the history of disarmament, which is what I felt like, because there's a lot of stuff in here. But he goes on to say, it seems a remote and mistaken topic, that it may well be. Nevertheless, it has profound lessons today, especially on the relationship among military, economic, political, and psychological aspects of our lives. It is perfectly clear today that the French and their allies, especially Czechoslovakia, were correct in their insistence that security must precede disarmament, and that disarmament agreements must be enforced by inspection rather than by good faith. that France was correct in these matters, as well as in insistence that the forces of aggression were still alive in Germany, although laying low. It is now admitted by all and is supported by all the evidence. Moreover, Anglo-Americans adopted French emphasis on the priority of security and the need for inspection in their own disarmament. Discussions with the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. The French idea that political questions, including military, are more fundamental than economic considerations is now also accepted, even in the United States, which is opposed most vigorously in the 1920s and early 1930s. The fact that the secure states could have made errors such as these in that earlier period reveals much about the nature of human thinking, especially in its proclivity to regard necessities as unimportant when they are present, like oxygen, food, or security, but to think nothing else when they are lacking. And that just kind of reminds me of like what's going on today. This business as usual, but it seems like we have all these resources available, but at the tip of a hat, they can ration us and turn off the flow of resources because the powers that are here, they have control of most of them, and most people aren't thinking about these things because they're available and they haven't had to deal with it. So that was one thing that really stuck out to me.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that ties in with that is who is, if you talk about resources or things that can be taken away with the flip of a switch and we have no say in it, when he outlines the stages of reparations on page 305, right after what you just read there. First of all, he talks about the reparations covering a period from 1919 to 1932. And there's the preliminary payments, 1919 to 1921, the London schedule, May 1921 to September 1924. And then these two, which I thought were kind of key. The Dawes Plan from September 1924 to January 1930, and the Young Plan, which was January 1930 to June 1931. Now, on the face of it, first of all, Dawes and Young were both from J.P. Morgan.
Yep.
So these are the international banker expert class. And what got crafted out of this was the Bank for International Settlements.
Yep.
And,
amen.
Yep. And that is just very, very fascinating. He said, and I don't need to read it all. I mean, this is on page 310. But, just talking about how they got their names, what were the funds that were involved in the reparations of each plan. But I'll read a little bit about the Young Plan, the second one, that leads into the Bank for International Settlements. He said the Young Plan, which was to have been a final settlement of the reparations question, lasted for less than 18 months, and the reason why was the New York stock market crash. And that was 1929, and that marked the end of the decade of Reconstruction and opened the decade of destruction between the two wars. The crash ended the American loans to Germany, and this cut off the flow of foreign exchange, which made it possible for Germany to appear as if it were paying reparations. Now, he outlines the technicalities of what was going on there and actually repaying the debt.
The bankers were just taking all of Germany's money and selling it for other currencies because Germany's money supply kept getting inflated, and the bankers just made a fortune off of it. I think he even actually said that they were in heaven in one part, that they were just hand over fist.
It was, but what was interesting to me, what I don't think I realized, because Quigley says emphatically that it was not the onerous burden of the reparations that drove Germany into hyperinflation and thus into the war, that they were crippled and not able to repay it. What I didn't realize until reading through this was the amount of loans that that the great powers were giving to Germany.
Yep.
And what he said right there, it helped Germany appear to be paying on their reparations, but in fact what they were doing was building up their own infrastructure. Not they were building up their manufacturing. They were using it to fortify themselves and not repay the reparations, which is very interesting.
Yeah, he said every municipality had a post office and a swimming pool, and that Germany had the most advanced railroad system. And they were still ahead of France, and France was still upset because even after the war, Germany was still growing and ahead of France.
Absolutely. And so these are things to ponder, because we're not going to hear the whole story from Quigley, but
that's right here. Using these American loans, Germany's industry was largely re-equipped with the most advanced technical facilities, and then he says the pools, all that. With its American loans, Germany was able to rebuild her. It's so funny. He always says her industrial systems to make it the second best in the world by a wide margin, to keep up her prosperity and her standard of living in spite of the defeat and reparations, and to pay reparations without either a balanced budget or a favorable balance of trade. By these loans, Germany's creditors were able to pay their war debts to England and the United States without sending goods or services. Foreign exchange went to Germany as loans, back to Italy, Belgium, France, and Britain as reparation, and finally back to the United States as payments on war debts. The only things wrong with the system were that it would collapse as soon as the United States ceased to lend. In the meantime, the debts were merely being shifted from one account to another, and no one was really getting any nearer to solvency. In the period 1924 to 1931, Germany paid 10.5 billion marks in reparations, but borrowed abroad a total of 18.6 billion marks. Not settled by all this, but the international bankers sat in heaven under a rain of fees and commissions.
Exactly. And they needed an exchange for all of this money that was flowing back and forth. Germany supposedly transferring their reparations. So what did they get out of this? A new private bank called the Bank for International Settlements, established in Switzerland, owned by the chief central banks of the world and holding accounts for each of them. The Bank for International Settlements was to serve as a central bankers' bank and allow international payments to be made merely by shifting credits from one country's account to another on the books of the bank. Now, I think this is, decidedly one of the most important things to come out of all of this. It's clear. I mean, even Quigley himself talks about the failure to actually get the reparations out of Germany, the fact that built into all of the various treaties and parts of the treaty were ways in which they could and did ultimately rearm and then take over, remilitarize the Rhineland, for instance. So that was fascinating to me. This is the very last couple of paragraphs here of this chapter. He said, before we turn to the background of these other problems, which I think we're going to get in the next section, we should say a few words about the question of how much was paid in reparations, or if any reparations were ever paid at all. The question arose because of a dispute regarding the value of the reparations paid before the Dawes Plan of 1924. From 1924 to 1931, the Germans paid about 10.5 billion marks. For the period before 1924, the German estimate of reparations paid is 56,577 billion marks, while the Allied estimate is 10,426 billion. Since the German estimate covers everything that could possibly be put in, including the value of the naval vessels they themselves scuttled in 1918, it cannot be accepted. A fair estimate would be about 30 billion marks for the period before 1924, or about 40 billion marks for reparations as a whole. It is sometimes argued that the Germans really paid nothing on reparations, since they borrowed abroad just as much as they ever paid on reparations, and that these loans were never paid. This is not quite true, since the total of foreign loans was less than 19 billion marks, while the Allies' own estimate of total reparations paid was over 21 billion marks. However, it is quite true that after 1924, Germany borrowed more than it paid in reparations, and thus the real payments on these obligations were all made before 1924. Moreover, the foreign loans which Germany borrowed could never have been made but for the existence of the reparations system. Since these loans greatly strengthened Germany by rebuilding its industrial plant, the burden of reparations as a whole on Germany's economic system was very slight. I think that that is quite thought-provoking, because we get, hyperinflation, and how the Germans had no choice but to go to war, that the whole Versailles Treaty meant that they had to go to war. You've got the starving Germans and the wheelbarrows full of cash. Then if you look at the bankers, they're giving all of these loans. Why would a banker loan money? Well, it's to get the payment back, right? With interest.
Yeah, that's what they put interest on all their loans, obviously. And then all the other nations weren't even allowing Germany to pay reparations because they wouldn't accept goods and service from Germany, because everyone was still nationalistic back then. And we all know that I don't remember who said this, but we all should know that war is the health of the state. So what do you got to do?
Yeah.
I remember who said that.
The goods and services thing and the nationalistic, you can see that from a political point of view. But if you're thinking about it just about money, you've got to ask who benefited. Who benefited from Germany not really making reparations, not paying back their loans, but building themselves up?
The great powers.
Exactly.
Those faceless individuals.
Yeah.
Faceless. They're just big G with the power.
Well, is there anything else that...
I don't know. I always try to catch those little nuggets in there, and it's the Dawes plan, like you said, J.P. Morgan. There's always the same names. Mm-hmm. These bankers. Yeah, Germany couldn't balance its budget because it wasn't selling enough abroad, so they couldn't, and they just kept getting loans. And yeah, I don't really have much else to say. It's just a few things in there. I had a lot highlighted. I didn't know what particularly to focus on because there's so much going on in those 20 years. And then he also expands out past that. He even talks about what happened in Korea in 1950. So he's covering more than a few decades in there, but it was a good educational experience for me, because this was something that I was never taught in American schools. And that whenever you get your lessons in school about history, it's always your nation is the greatest and those guys are the bad guys. And I don't think there's anything near this detailed that I would ever learn just with a public education.
No, that's so true. There's just one little thing that made me laugh though. So Versailles, the Palace of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles, and at one point I don't remember which conference they were having or what document they were signing, but they did it in the the Versailles Hall of Mirrors. That was pretty fitting because, for us down here, it really is all smoke and mirrors, and
yeah, that's where the German Empire, or I think where the German Empire was founded, or something he was saying about. That's where they started, and then that's where they signed it. But the Hall of Mirrors, that struck me too. I'm like thinking, what does it look like in there? Wait, is it? I don't know. Probably more figurative than literal, but still, you never know.
I like that. At the talk that we just did on World War I finished up with some footage on the video from that movie, Oh, What a Lovely War. And it's right near the end when the soldier's coming in and he's dead. I mean, we're seeing dead man walking, and he's walking along this red cord in the old ballroom, and just going past all of the great powers sitting at their banquet table, and they all are looking at their huge documents, and then they just pass it one to the other. And he's walking by, and that's a beautiful and tragic visualization of what this is all about, because we little ones are always used, we're sacrificed, we're cannon fodder for plans that we've really no idea what it's about.
And we're trying, we'd like to know, but grasping in the dark here, and it's our job to try to, I think, get as much information and wisdom out of these little bits and scraps of information that we can pull together and pass it down to the next generation if we can, and leave a record for those that come behind us.
Well said. Okay, well, I think this is going to do it for the Treaty of Versailles, and the reading assignment for the month of May, once again, is Chapter 7, Finance, Commercial Policy, and Business Activity, 1897 to 1947, and then Chapter 8, which is International Socialism and the Soviet Challenge. So that is the month of May. And Jared, thank you.
Of course. It was a pleasure, and I really enjoyed it, having this discussion and participating with the group. And there's a lot more in here. I had my eye on the New Age, like I said, but these next two chapters aren't that long, so it's not too bad, I don't think.
No, and I think it's just peeking ahead a little bit. It looks like it's a nice welcome change from where we've been. So you get a sweeping overview of how the money works.
Yeah, I agree.
Alrighty then, somebody, I don't know who, but somebody towards the end of May will bring you some commentary on these two sections. And everybody take care, and thanks for being a part of the book club.